Welcome back to another edition of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, coming at you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. So nice to have you back today. We're still recovering from this election, and it's been a disappointment for so many of us. And it's going to have consequences. I've been saying this for months. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of those consequences with Jeffrey Rath, who's the chief counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project. This is going to be one hell of an interview. Don't miss it.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station. It helps us overcome the YouTube censorship or suppression. Not the censorship, just the suppression. And it helps this station to grow. Thank you so much for your help and support. And subscribe. You've been doing that in great numbers lately, and we have been growing by leaps and bounds. So without further ado, I want to bring in Chief Counsel, I hope I got that right, Jeffrey Rath of the Alberta Prosperity
General
Project.
Counsel. Yeah.
General, okay.
General Counsel.
Chief Counsel sounds so much better.
Yeah, no,
sounds like,
I appreciate
sounds like
that.
you're gonna start investigating a Watergate or something, but it's nice to have you back, Jeff. When we had you here about a month and a half ago, and of course we were talking about your, at that time, proposed trip to Washington, and we'll get into that shortly, but really want to start off with a quote, or quotation actually, from you. You said after this tragedy that occurred Monday night, this election we had in Canada, you said that Canada just voted to separate from Alberta. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty self-evident. I mean, the population of Toronto and Montreal decided that they should elect a Chinese communist adjacent World Economic Forum globalist and completely inimical to Alberta interests, shutting down Alberta pipelines, basically running around the world saying that there's no unbelievably that there's no business case for Alberta liquid natural gas, which is one of the cleanest and most dependable fuels in the world. Basically, so working with Trudeau to shut down the Alberta economy for the last 10 years in the name of climate foolishness. And, for whatever reason, the people of Toronto and Montreal got suckered into literally voting Alberta out of Canada by electing, King Carney to rule over us as his colonial serfs, and Albertans aren't going to tolerate it anymore, period.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. I just put that slide up so people can see exactly what you're talking about. We have these big 3 zeros in the west of Canada. That means they get nothing in equalization payments. But look at the money going to Quebec, for instance, $13.3 billion. And who's paying for it? Mostly Alberta. So, yes, I certainly understand what you're talking about. And I think a lot of people, even in Eastern Canada, are sympathetic to what's going on here. And I am very familiar with Western separatist movements over the years. I'm old enough to remember the Western Canada concept, WestFed. I'm old enough to remember the Western resentment because I grew up in British Columbia. I still consider myself a Westerner. And I remember how Alberta had to fight tooth and nail for the autonomy over its natural resources with Pierre Trudeau. And I think it's going to have to do that with Mark Carney. But is an independent Alberta more viable now than ever before?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the reality of it is, I mean, Alberta still has the world's third largest petroleum reserve, like oil reserve, with the discovery of the Montney field at 400 trillion. Think about this: 400 trillion cubic feet of natural gas a good chunk of which is out in Alberta. Alberta is probably now in the top 5 countries in the world for natural gas reserves. We have over 50% of Canada's metallurgical coal. Along with Saskatchewan, we produce just a phenomenal amount of cereal, grains, and agriculture. We literally feed the entire world out of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta is completely viable as one of the few provinces in Canada that would be completely viable as a standalone independent nation state. We send $70 billion a year to Ottawa, including CPP, UI, and all the taxes that get sucked out of Alberta to subsidize Quebec so that Quebec can run surplus budgets while Alberta is having to run deficits and borrow money to pay our doctors and nurses and pave our roads, etc. Right? So, we're fed up. We're done with it. But enough of the grievances. I mean, the real reason we think that this is going to succeed this year is a simple economic message, right? And that is that King Carney can offer nothing to Albertans that will immediately put money in their pockets, right? The day that we declare independence in Alberta is the day that every Albertan will no longer ever have to file a federal tax return. So there'll be no more federal income tax. There'll be no more GST. There'll be no more carbon tax on industry or personal transportation, home heating, or whatever. So people's costs are going to go down. There's going to be no more federal capital gains tax, no more federal corporate tax. We're going to become the lowest taxed regime in North America. So, we actually, unlike Quebec, when Quebec announced, independence, or the referendum leading up to the referendums the last couple times around in Quebec, corporate headquarters were flooding out of Quebec. We see the opposite problem with Alberta declaring independence, and that's that corporate headquarters are going to be flooding into Alberta to take advantage of what's going to become the lowest taxed business regime in North America. The other thing is, and I guess you'd mentioned that we were, that we've been meeting with the United States. Myself and several members of our delegation to Washington group were in Washington, D.C. last week. And had very, very positive meetings at an extremely high level in the U.S. administration. There's a great appetite for what we're doing. We're very confident that the United States will support an independent Alberta following a referendum. We're very confident that a free trade agreement with the United States can almost be immediately reached. That would be based on zero tariffs on either side of the Alberta U.S. border on all goods and services. We're also very confident that we're going to be able to expand the number of pipelines leaving Alberta through Montana, both to Tidewater and Washington, and further pipelines to Texas and other refining centers in the U.S. That would allow us to double Alberta oil production within 3 to 5 years. Because, of course, we'd be out of the Paris Climate Accord. There'll be no more emission caps. There's going to be no production caps. There's going to be no more federal regulation whatsoever on any aspect of life in the province of Alberta. Think about that for a second. No more, silly little gun, regulations that a Liberal can bring in anytime they have a nightmare or wet dream about firearms, whatever it is that they do. No more arbitrary environmental regulations. No more arbitrary impositions of taxes on hardworking men and women because idiots in Ottawa, including King Carney, think that somehow taxing men and women, hardworking men and women, is going to change the weather. As an aside, it just reminds me of the ancient Aztecs cutting out the hearts of working men and women as human sacrifices, because they think that's going to make it rain or change the weather. Well, we have idiots in Ottawa that actually think that if they tax working men and women to death, that's going to change the weather. It's the same level of magical thinking that we can't tolerate anymore as Albertans.
Yeah, I want to show you a poll here that was actually commissioned by my good friend and colleague, Rachel Parker, and it was done by Main Street. And this is, if you look at the date at the top, is March 20th. Now, this is well in advance of the election. And poll number 1 is, do you support an independent Alberta? 44% strongly oppose, 26% strongly support, 11% somewhat support, 7% aren't really sure. But if you take the 26 and the 11, that's 37% in March who are basically supporting an independent Alberta. And I find that absolutely fascinating because I think those numbers probably have gone up because at that time we had some hope that there was going to be an alternative to Mark Carney. And I'll just show you the second slide because these are kind of hard to read. But if a referendum were held today, 56% want to stay, 25% want to leave, and 19% aren't really sure. So once again, there's a lot of room there for growth, and these are not numbers I think that we have seen for a long time, or if ever. And I think this is why I asked you the question about is this the best viable time in the history of Alberta, because these numbers would suggest this could happen. And my question for you is how long would this take?
Well, oh, that's the question. Sorry. Well, here's where things are at. So again, as you noted, that poll was done on March 20th, right? The other thing about that poll, that was done without people having had the ability, without us having even started our advertising campaign yet to educate the bulk of the province on the benefits of independence, including no longer having to file federal income tax returns. Okay, which is a massive benefit. I mean, the day, what's King Carney going to offer Alberta, right? The way we like it, it's like, Alberta's already moved out of the matrimonial home thanks to this election. They're in a shelter, protecting themselves from your abusive ex-spouse, soon to be ex-spouse. They have a restraining order in place, and along comes little Mr. Carney with his box of chocolates, and he's going to offer Alberta some sweeties to stay in, to go back to getting punched in the face. I mean, it's not going to sell, right? So he offers an energy corridor. Well, we already know Quebec's not going to let Alberta oil flow through Quebec. They've said so. He said that he's not going to retire the No More Pipelines bill. So what's he going to offer? He says, we're going to make it Canada an energy superpower. But he's talking about so-called sustainable energy, which means what? He's going to give us $1 billion or $2 or $3 billion of our own money to build hydrogen plants in Alberta. Give me a break. I mean, this whole thing is completely ridiculous, right? So leave that aside. The other thing is that people need to internalize that Danielle Smith just passed legislation to lower the threshold required to hold a referendum on independence in Alberta. So the old threshold was 20% of the complete electorate, which was 600,000 people, right? The new threshold is 10% of whoever it was that voted, of voter turnout in the last election, which is 177,000 more or less, right? So since the election of King Carney to rule over Alberta as our new colonial overlord, over 150,000 people have registered with the Alberta Prosperity Project in advance of the referendum to vote yes, and have pledged that they're going to vote yes in a referendum, right? So those are the signatures that we're going to need to have a referendum under the Citizens Initiative. Our current website, I think at APP, is showing 128,000 signatures in the last 4 days. But right now we're in a process of reconciling. That doesn't count all the previous APP members, of which we have 77,000, right? That doesn't count lists that we've been provided by other independence groups, other people that have been running for various offices in Alberta that have their own lists, et cetera, that are all signing up. So right now we're engaged in a process through APP of collating all of this information, running it through AI, making sure that we have absolutely pristine lists of people in support of independence to get ready for the independence campaign, right? And our internal numbers right now, even taking into account shrinkage where, we have duplicates that needed to be weeded out and the rest of it, our internal numbers now have us somewhere over 200 to 250,000 signatures that we have with contact information internally that we have to work with. So I anticipate that on, after this weekend or within the next couple of days, APP will be making an announcement that we already have all of the signatures that we require under the amended Citizens Initiative Act to have a referendum. Now, this gets into a little bit of inside baseball. We've got this weird sort of overlapping period between the old legislation and the new legislation. So we'd like to go sooner rather than later, because if we wait until July for the new legislation to be promulgated, there's a 120-day period within which signatures are to be gathered. Then after the 120-day period, if signatures had to be verified or whatever, we could literally be into, January, February, March before we could hold a referendum. So what we're trying to do as a goal for APP is to have 600,000 signatures by the end of May. Given the enthusiasm for independence right now in Alberta and the degree to which Albertans have been insulted by Quebec and Ontario voting Alberta out of Canada, we think that the 600,000 goal within the next 30 days is entirely achievable. I mean, we've literally had 128,000 signatures, in the last, or more, in the last 4 days. So we're working on 600,000 signatures by the end of May, and we want to have 1 million pledges by the end of July. So I think, as you can see, we have a very ambitious plan, but we think it's achievable, or we wouldn't be announcing it right now. And we're absolutely confident that by next week, we have and once all of our lists are collated and verified and so on, that we're going to have the signatures that are required to hold a referendum under the new, under the new standard. The only issue is, and I think lots of people within Alberta are reaching out to Premier Smith and writing Premier Smith and so on, saying, hey, wait a minute, why do we need a 120-day period, right, for signature gathering? If we have all of the signatures in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it is, which we think is possible under the new standard, can the legislation, which hasn't been tabled yet in the legislature, why can't the legislation read 120 days or until such time as the requisite number of signatures, are gathered and verified, whichever is sooner. That's how we want the new legislation to read, because the people on my team, are confident that we can have, we're organized enough and we'll have enough support to have a referendum this calendar year and vote Alberta out of Canada this calendar year.
Well, that at one time I would have thought that's very optimistic. I don't think it is. I want to show you 2 clips, because I've been talking all week about the reasons Alberta has for separation. And the first clip is, of course, Mark Carney. We didn't hear much from Mark Carney about net zero during the campaign, at least when he was in Western Canada. And the second clip is from the leader of the Bloc Québécois, talking about Quebec's complete refusal to have pipelines go through its province.
Demanded action. And now it's time for the financial sector to deliver. To reach net zero, every country, every company, every bank, every investor, every pension fund around the world will need to make some big changes. In the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow, we have an enormous opportunity to bring climate change into the heart of every financial decision. And our plan will manage the risks from climate change while helping to seize the opportunities from a newer, greener economy. The UK has been at the forefront of innovation for centuries, brimming with ingenuity and a can-do spirit. It also houses the world's largest financial system, and by bringing them together, we can deliver the net zero world that you've demanded and that our future generations deserve. The world's coming to Glasgow. Let's reshape finance for a sustainable world.
So, of course, that's Mark Carney in his glory days talking about net zero, and something, as I say, he didn't talk much about during the campaign. And here's the Bloc.
And we will have to remain the barrier not to be crossed, protecting French language and secularity of the state in Quebec, and a different model in immigration which has to be successful, and the fact that there's no future for oil and gas, at least in Quebec and probably everywhere, and this has to be said and protected. I have a brand new weapon to do that. Mr. Bonin will be extraordinary carrying that message.
So this kills me. Quebec is getting $16 billion, largely from Alberta. Yet they don't want to put your oil through the problem. And you know what? Quebec is sitting on oil reserves, enormous oil reserves. And maybe if they tapped into those reserves, they wouldn't have to steal money from Alberta.
No. But they're also stealing money from Michael Binion. I don't know whether you're aware or followed the story, but there's an Albertan by the name of Michael Binion who actually went to Quebec and explored for and discovered those massive oil and gas reserves under licenses and permits and leases from the government of Quebec. And now Michael is embroiled in massive litigation with the government of Quebec because, of course, the government of Quebec has expropriated those licenses and leases and said, thank you for finding all this oil and gas for us. Ha ha, we're not going to let you develop it. You can go twist, and we're going to hang on to it for ourselves, and we'll only worry about it once we sucked Alberta absolutely dry of every nickel and every BTU that we can take out of them, through other means. Is the situation. So yeah, no, and New Brunswick also has massive oil and gas reserves. Nova Scotia has massive gas reserves offshore of Sable Island, but the Canadian federal government won't permit them to develop them for spurious environmental reasons, et cetera, et cetera. So, this whole, the whole climate craziness that we're dealing with, is something that Albertans just can't tolerate anymore. I mean, China and India are continuing to build coal-fired power plants at a massive rate. Their increase in CO2 every year dwarfs any savings in Canada. Like Canada's contribution to global CO2 is, the whole country is 2% of global CO2. If we were to completely eliminate all human life in Canada and be zero emission of CO2 by humans in Canada, it would make no difference whatsoever to the 10% per annum increase in CO2 output from China and India. So again, and I've written about it in my Substack, The Road to Freedom with Jeffrey Rath, on previous occasions. The reason that Gibault and Carney and all these idiots are doing this, they say, is so that they can hold their heads up high when they meet with India and China and berate them from a moral process, as to why their people should remain in poverty and why they shouldn't be burning, carbon-based energy for the wealth of their people. So in the meantime, they want to beggar Alberta, they want to beggar Canadians, just so that they can hold the moral high ground while they talk to people about something that isn't a problem. Because again, like the other thing that all the climate nuts don't want to talk about is that CO2 is plant food. And in the last number of years, the vegetative mass of the planet Earth has increased by over 20% thanks to all the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. None of the climate nut jobs want to talk about that and the fact that the planet is self-regulating and that, none of this is a real problem. But no, we can't talk about that. We need to tax working men and women into oblivion and carry on with all of these stupid policies that are literally just designed to siphon money out of the pockets of hardworking Canadians and enrich all of Mark Carney's buddies in and around the World Economic Forum table by, investing in all of these so-called sustainable industries that only work with massive government subsidies from an economic perspective. They all know that. We're just hamsters on the wheel to them, and we just have to keep working to generate money so that they can then, meet every year in Davos and find out, and discuss what their next fraudulent scheme is for, whether it's bug plants or battery plants or hydrogen plants or whatever it is, what their next fraudulent scheme is for sucking money out of the pockets of hardworking men and women, and to enrich all of the oligarchs sitting around that table.
Exactly. I don't know how many times I've said on this broadcast or written in my various articles I write over the year that how little Canada contributes to the greenhouse gas, and it's negligible. But want to get to this because this really interests me. Preston Manning and the Canada West Assembly. I've always had a lot of time for Preston Manning. I went to the House of Commons as a staffer for Art Hanger, going back quite a few years, and met Preston Manning, got to know Preston Manning, and thought, here's a real leader and probably the best prime minister we never had. But I'm wondering about this Canada West because, as Derek Fildebrandt pointed out in an interview with Preston the other day, He said, why Canada West? And because it sounds like you're still saying the idea is to stay in Canada and not West Canada Assembly. Is this a stalling tactic from Preston Manning?
Of course it is. And I mean, I in a recent column I wrote, I referred to, Preston Manning, as yesterday's Federalist, right? He's still a Federalist. I mean, he still thinks somehow or other that he can bring everybody together and we're gonna somehow magically resolve, all of the inequities in Confederation. We see this as just a big money suck on Preston's part. He's really good at, coming forward and raising money for the Preston Manning Foundation and so on. He's been sending out fundraising emails to everybody to pay for his latest talking shop, where everybody across the West can get together and waste time, talking about how we're going to get, be taken seriously by Canada and getting, it's all the same bullshit West wants in crap that hasn't worked for us before. I mean, the very definition of insanity is doing the same stupid shit over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, that's what Manning is doing. And we're fed up. And on top of it, the fundraising letter that he sent out was a complete insult to all of the hardworking, men and women that are volunteering for APP and are working around APP. He's trying to make us look like we're some minuscule, little group of, malcontents. He referred to us as extremists and eccentrics, who should not be leading the conversation on, independence. And it should be left to, statesmen and responsible politicians like himself, to convene these talking shops where they blah, 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 everything to death, without actually doing anything except raising money, lining their pockets, and doing very, very well, doing what they do, which is just talking ad nauseum without accomplishing anything. So, if that makes my position on Preston Manning is a bit too subtle, I apologize. But that's how we feel about it, certainly within our organization. And the other thing I want to mention too, sorry, just on a final point on that.
I was going to say, I think Preston has been auto-washed over the years because he's a different man today than the one who went to Ottawa in the early 90s. And
no, but he's like he's like a dampening rod in a nuclear reactor. And I mean, that's kind of how Danielle Smith is using him and how governments are using him. It's like, they're trying to get him to tamp down, the flames of Alberta independence that have literally turned into a conflagration, and appeal to the soft independence vote, the people that still want more independence within Canada, which we all know is an impossibility. He's still appealing to those people, and he's raising lots of money for himself doing that, right? So, it works. That shtick works for him. It works for Danielle. It works for people in government that are still hopeful that that what we're doing and the movement we've created can somehow be used to negotiate a better deal within Canada. But none of us are interested in that anymore. What can they offer us? Like, what can they offer the average citizen of Alberta? Can they offer every citizen of Alberta a 30% pay increase? That's what we're doing, right? So we have some mega projects, big whoop. So Murray Edwards gets richer. He can buy another castle in England. Whatever. The billionaires, their stock prices will continue to go up. The status quo is maintained. 5 years from now, jobs, will actually start trickling down to Alberta outside of the planning and engineering and environmental shops, whatever. This doesn't benefit, doctor or nurses, firemen, policemen, average working people, that are paying 20, 30% income tax a year, along with all of the other punitive taxes that are levied by Ottawa, on top of all of the, ridiculous regulations that are just arbitrarily imposed upon us, as, making us human sacrifices, with the view that punitive taxes are going to change the weather. I mean, it's, all of this is over. Albertans are done. Like, we have such a strong economic message to sell the citizens of Alberta. There's nothing that our colonial masters and all of those people in the employ of our colonial masters, like Jason Kenney and other Trudeau liberals of his ilk, have to sell. I think their day is done. It's a new Alberta. It's a new West. And people need to get their head around it. This is not the Western Canada concept anymore. This is everybody in Alberta is at a breaking point. We're done with all this foolishness. and we're out of here. Like, we're done.
Yeah. Yes, I can see you're done. The media pushback, of course, has already started, the fear mongering. But I found it interesting that the story coming out of the Calgary Herald about three First Nation chiefs are issuing stark warnings that their treaty rights predate Alberta's entry into the Confederation. And I thought, do they realize that Jeffrey Rath is a litigator for First Nations? So what are you doing about that to take that into consideration?
Well, yeah, I think that the Alberta Prosperity Project will be writing a letter to the chiefs today explaining to them, first of all, that the reason that APP was founded separate and apart from some of the other independence groups was out of concern for the fact that other independence groups in Alberta weren't taking the issue of treaty and Aboriginal rights and Indigenous rights in Alberta seriously. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are not educated in this area that think that Alberta independence means you wave a fairy wand and somehow or another Indians cease to exist or First Indigenous people cease to exist in Alberta and their rights cease to exist. That's simply a non-starter. So the reason I got involved and was involved in founding APP, along with Lawrence Courtoret, a former vice chief of the Assembly First Nations, et cetera, was to make sure that there was a vehicle for Alberta independence that had a strong foundation of respect for the Indigenous rights of the Indigenous people of Alberta built into the core of the organization, which is what APP is all about. We actually get ovations from people when we talk about how strong APP and how strong an independent Alberta is going to be in support of Indigenous rights. I mean, this is, like, I've been litigating against Canada my entire working career. I can tell you that Canada by far treats the Indigenous people of Alberta worse than it treats Albertans. It's like clear treaty rights to education, clear treaty rights, to economic and agricultural benefits, under the treaty. I mean, things that are absolutely inarguable. Canada litigates, for 10, 20, 30 years and then settles at pennies on the dollar afterwards, right? Canada is no friend of the Indigenous people of Alberta. And, we're looking forward to being able to, with an independent Alberta, having constitutionalized Indigenous rights within the framework of the Constitution, constitutionalized resource revenue sharing, within the Alberta Constitution with, the Indigenous nations of Alberta. And I suppose for those groups that want to stay outside of Alberta and want to continue to, live on bended knee to Mummy Ottawa and have Mummy Ottawa give them whatever they, whatever they ask for 20 years after they ask for it, they'd be free to do that. But those Indigenous nations of Alberta that want a new deal and want to have a new constitutionalized relationship with the independent Commonwealth of Alberta, that will be open to them. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't, in my heart of hearts, believe that there's a far better deal to be struck with an independent Alberta on a going forward basis for the Indigenous nations of Alberta than there would be, than Indigenous nations remaining in Canada. I wouldn't be doing this if I did not believe that this was what we were going to accomplish. And this is at the core of the mission of the Alberta Prosperity Project.
Yeah, and I found it interesting. I was watching an interview you did recently, and the question was asked, what are you going to do about national defense? And I thought, does this person realize the state of national defense? I mean, literally, we have no Leopard tanks remaining. We gave them all to Ukraine, and they're blown up on the battlefield.
I'm sure happy they did, though, because I understand that David Lametti and Mark Mendocino are going to be in a King Carney government, and they won't have Leopard tanks to crush protesters under their treads the way they wanted to during the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. So, I guess it's just as well we don't have any working tanks, because unfortunately the policy of the Liberal government is if tanks are available, you should use them to crush protesters like they did in China in Tiananmen Square. So, just as well that those tanks have been taken away from them,
But my point being, though, is that the state of the Canadian Armed Forces is so deplorable. We can't even replenish the ammunition we gave to Ukraine. We have nothing left.
Oh, no. Didn't you hear, though? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but didn't you hear that Trudeau's great plan for that was to confiscate Western Canadian gopher guns and fill, container loads of mixed matched firearms without magazines, without training manuals, without ammunition, and send all of our guns to the front in Ukraine so that the Ukrainian conscripts could hold our 22 caliber semi-automatic Gopher guns in the face of Spetsnaz soldiers? I mean, the whole thing is just ludicrous.
My point still being, though, I don't think Alberta will have any difficulty replicating what Canada already has as a national
Well, no,
defense.
but just one other point I wanted to make, like, as well as all of the signatures that have been flooding into APP over the last 4 days, and it's been a real challenge for us organizationally. All of us have been working around the clock, putting in 15, 16, 17-hour days. I do admit that I did stop to watch the Oilers beat LA last night in overtime, so we do find some time. But anyway, in the last 4 days, we've had over 15,000 volunteers come forward that we're now in the process of onboarding. So we have a 87 constituency door knocking campaign planned in support of getting referendum signatures. We're going to have an 87 constituency door knocking campaign and canvassing campaign being planned in support of the actual referendum itself. And we now have more volunteers in APP than they have infantry men and women in the Canadian Armed Forces. Think about that, right? We don't have 15,000 infantry left in the Canadian Army. Like, it's ludicrous. We have more. I couldn't believe it. I had to look this up one day when somebody told me this was true, because I thought it was just so bizarre. We have more tax collectors in Canada, 65,000 of them, than we do all men and women in all branches of service in the Canadian Armed Forces. We have like 35,000 in total. And as you know from your service, and I know from my service, when you actually look at boots on the ground and actual combat troops within the Canadian military, our structure is so weak and so poor that the actual boots on the ground are the smallest part of the Canadian Armed Forces. So I would be surprised if we even had a single division of combat effective troops left in the Canadian military in the form of infantry, combat engineers, armored corps personnel, artillerymen, etc. Right?
Yeah, I would be very surprised too. Where do you think Premier Danielle Smith stands in all of this? In her heart, you can't really know, but what's your gut feeling about how she feels about this whole issue?
Well, I mean, you have to take her at her word in terms of her public statements. Some weeks she's Alberta first, some weeks she's Team Canada. So we're not really sure exactly. I think, I personally think that she's going to be, using, this movement to try to negotiate the best deal that she can for Mark Carney. But I think that I don't think that there's going to be any satisfaction coming to Alberta from Mark Carney. And I think the problem for Premier Smith is, whether it's the lowered standard in the new legislation or the old standard, that the level of anger and the level of interest in independence in Alberta is such, from an economic perspective, that there's no putting this back in the box. I mean, it's, the box has literally been shattered. We are going to be moving forward to a referendum one way or another, this calendar year or early in next. And given the level of support that we're seeing, I think it's inevitable that first of all, a referendum is an absolute certainty, right? And I would suggest that the odds of a successful referendum occurring on the basis of a question that's been formulated to say that that Alberta will form an independent sovereign country and separate and apart from Canada, that question will garner, the odds of it garnering over 55% are probably 60 or 70% right now. And that's without a full-blown public education campaign, billboards, Facebook advertising, all of the things that we're planning, one sheets on the economy to show people what the advantages are. I mean, the only thing the other side has to offer us are threats. Oh, we're going to cut off your pipelines. Well, you've done that already, right? We're going to do this to you. Well, you've done that too. So, and Canada needs to remember that 75% of Ontario's, container goods flow through Alberta by rail. So, I mean, if they want to start talking, we're going to shut down your pipelines and all this other nonsense that's never going to happen because they'd be shutting off their own oil. I mean, what does a 30% tariff on all container goods moving through Alberta look like? Right? I mean, it's never going to happen. Be clear, David. I mean, at the end of the day, Alberta's going to declare its independent, or Alberta's going to vote for independence. We're going to be recognized by the United States as an independent country. We'll be negotiating nation to nation with Canada with regard to what the final terms of the divorce are going to look like. And people are going to have to roll up their sleeves as adults to negotiate the best possible deal for both Alberta and Canada on a going forward basis, but with Alberta outside of the country. So that's, I mean, that's the future.
Well, you sort of anticipated my last question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think Mark Carney will offer concessions to quench this desire for independence? But do you think those concessions will be dismissed as just the usual, the same old, same old?
No, but that's it exactly. Like I said, I mean, Alberta is a battered spouse living in a halfway house, and Carney's going to show up with a little box of chocolates trying to talk her into coming home. It's not happening. And he's already said what he's not going to do. He's not going to get rid of the anti-pipeline bill. He's not going to get rid of emission caps. He's not going to concede that Ottawa has no business or jurisdiction in capping oil and gas production in the province of Alberta. He's not going to concede that Ottawa has no business passing environmental regulations for the province of Alberta, et cetera, et cetera. So there's nothing that Carney has to offer the average Albertan, right, that is going to exceed the value by far of the immediate 30% pay raise that's going to go to every Albertan when they no longer have to file federal tax returns, no longer have to pay GST, no longer have to pay excise tax and fuel. Just the fact that our fuel prices are going to be cut in half the day after independence, is going to be a huge incentive, for Albertans. The very fact that, it's almost a certainty that the day Alberta declares independence, the U.S., it's going to be the shortest trade agreement of all time. We'll come to the table and sign a trade agreement that basically says it's complete free trade between Alberta and the United States with no tariffs on any goods or services on either side of the border, full stop, one-page trade agreement, right? Why wouldn't people vote for that? So, I mean, that's where we're going with this. Carney has nothing to offer Albertans that anywhere approaches the value of the things that I'm talking about. And he won't do it. He can't do it because it's the end of Confederation. You don't think the minute Quebec is told that they don't get their little $15 billion a year lollipop so that they can have surplus budgets in Quebec? Well, we have to borrow, money from, bankers to pay for our doctors and roads. You don't think the minute they're cut off of that $15 billion that they're not going to have their own referendum and declare independence? The only reason Quebec stays in Canada is because of the amount of money they can suck like a vacuum out of Alberta. But the minute that money's cut off, they're gone. King Carney is going to be, and I hate to, use the vernacular, but it's going to end up being king shit of Turd Mountain when this is all over. He will be the last prime minister of Canada as we know it, and he's going to be presiding over a disintegrating, country. So his dreams of world global economic domination, I don't know if you caught that one, but he was in Edmonton like 3 days before the election, and he announced, get this, that Alberta or Canada's economic or Canada's relationship with the United States is over, he said. And then immediately after that, he said America's place as the global economic leader is over. So he's got these delusions that somehow or other him and the Bank of England, and maybe by bringing Alberta into the EU or something or other, that he can displace the United States as the global leader of the global economy. The man is completely delusional.
Took the words right out of my mouth, but I've followed this issue very closely over the years, Jeffrey. I have family in Alberta, Calgary, Airdrie area. And I've always said, you're dreaming the impossible dream. But given what we've gone through, given how 10 catastrophic years of Justin Trudeau and the promise or the threats to come from Mark Carney, I don't think that's true anymore. And I've been saying this is a consequence of Mark Carney. This is a consequence of too many foolish Canadians thinking the Liberal Party is an answer to anything. And I would say if there's a silver lining for you, Jeffrey, it's that Mark Carney has made this all the more possible.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, like, as I said, like Mark Carney, is going to be the last prime minister of Canada. I mean, put that on your resume, Mark, right? Elbows up, Mark, right? How stupid are you? You know, to think that you could do and say the things that you're doing and that you're going to hold this country together. Like, you know, he's completely destroyed any consensus that we had in this country on how we're to be governed. And, you know, and Albertans are just saying, okay, well, you voted us out of Canada. I guess we're gone now. And it's just a matter of formalizing the divorce. Ontario, you know, Montreal and Toronto, thanks for hiring your divorce lawyer. I guess his name is Mark Carney. And, you know, we're now going to move forward to do what we need to do, you know, to finalize the terms of this and get on with our lives. But I do want to end, you know, on a positive note, you know, and that is specifically, I think both, you know, the country of Alberta and the country of Canada can be a lot stronger for this, right? You know, I think it'll force Quebec to develop its own natural oil and gas. It'll force New Brunswick to develop its own oil and gas. You know, it's going to force, you know, what's left of Canada to reevaluate, you know, interprovincial trade barriers as opposed to just talking about them, you know, after, you know, the Liberals start a phony trade war with the US, you know, to get elected. You know, there's a lot of positives that are going to come out of this, you know, for Canada as well, right? It's going to force Canadians to reevaluate how it is that they're governed, how poorly served they are by the Westminster system of governance, where they, you know, literally elect a, you know, a dictator, you know, every 5 years to have this person, you know, preside over us, you know, like literally like the king, where we are all subjects rather than citizens. You know, it's going to allow the rest of the country an opportunity to revisit its constitution, because it's going to have to, because Alberta's going to be gone. We'll have our own constitution.
Well, on that positive note, we'll end this interview. Thank you so much, Jeffrey Rath, the counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project, and Godspeed, Jeffrey. And
thank you very much, David. It's always a pleasure to come on your program and to talk to you. So thank you.
Bye for now.
Okay.
That was Jeffrey Rath, counsel for the, as I just said, Alberta Prosperity Project, and it's always a pleasure to talk to Jeffrey. He's always got some ideas about where Canada should go and where Alberta should go, and I think we're going to see some dire consequences this year. We're going to see reaction to Mark Carney's election, and I've been warning about this for a long time, and I think people are going to see some changes in this country that are going to be irrevocable. Thanks for watching today, everybody. God bless this country. God bless Alberta. And Godspeed to all of you. And thanks. We'll be back again tomorrow and possibly this afternoon, if I can get back in time to do a little conversation with Spencer from Make Canada Great Again. But we'll see if that happens. But I'll definitely be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching, folks, and we'll see you soon.